So today's lesson starts off by me asking you if you can think of any fractions that are the same as 1. A fraction that it and 1 have the same value. So take a minute, see if you can think of a fraction like that that has the same value as 1. Pause me, come back after you thought about it. When you're back, one example of a fraction that's the same as 1 would be something like 5/5. 5/5 is a fraction that's the same as 1. If you drew a blank before, now that you've seen 5/5, pause it, see if you can come up with some more. Pick like 3 of them. When you unpause, maybe something like 8/8. If now it makes sense, pick 2 more. Something like 100/100ths. If it finally clicked in, make another one. 17/17ths. If it didn't click at all and still now, I'll just tell you, any fraction where the numerator and denominator are the same is a fraction that's equal to 1. Whether that's 5/5, 8/8, 100/100ths, 17/17ths, any fraction where top and bottom match each other, that's the same thing as 1 whole. So we're going to make use of that today to do some subtracting problems. Yesterday we learned that when you add or subtract, you have to have a common denominator. If you don't have a common denominator, you'll have to make one. Okay, so here's a problem where we'd have to make one. If we have 1, which isn't a fraction, subtracting 1/3, which is, this needs to go out, and a fraction needs to come in its place. And we need a new problem that has a fraction instead of the 1, subtracting the 1/3. And how we're going to pick that fraction is we have to have a common denominator. Since this had 3 on the bottom, I'm going to make a 3 on the bottom. And the rule we just learned up here is that for 1 to be made into a fraction, we need top and bottom to be the same. And now we can do this answer. 1 minus 1/3, that's like 3/3, minus 1/3. That can get us 2/3. If you understand what's going on, pause the video and try to do 1 minus 5/7, do 1 minus 7/10, check yourself. If you can't do it, then I'll explain them in a second. We'll try again. So 1 minus 5/7, I need 1 to go and be a fraction. I need to pick a fraction where top and bottom match to have a common denominator with this. With 7 on the bottom of its friend, I need to go 7/7. 7/7 can trade for 1. That's a fair trade. Now we can subtract 5/7, and this answer would be 2/7. Remember, we keep the denominator a common denominator through to the answer. We're just subtracting the tops. One more time. If you didn't get it yet, pause it, get it, come back. 1's got to go. 1's going to make a fraction. Instead of 1, I'm going to do 10/10. I need these to match each other, and I need it to match the bottom of the other fraction friend. 10/10 steps in for 1. 1 can subtract 7/10 now that it's 10/10 minus 7/10. We have the common denominator of 10. Just subtract the tops. We've got a 3. Similar move, slightly different. Okay, if we get mixed numbers involved, you can't subtract an empty space minus something. Okay, this is a lot like the normal question, 50 minus 11. Like here we have a 1 and a 1, that's kind of like an 11. You have a 5 and an empty, that's kind of like a 5 and a 0. Most of you know by now successfully that you can't do littler stuff minus bigger stuff, you have to borrow. You borrow 1 from the 5 to make 4. And this is based on place values now. Since this is the tens place, you create 10 1s. That's a fair trade. 1 of the 10s is a fair trade for 10 of the 1s. And now you can subtract this stuff. 10 minus 1 is 9, 4 minus 1 is 3. We want to borrow. That's not the main theme of the day, but what we're doing is like that. This problem is also a borrow problem. You can't have an empty space subtracting a fraction space unless you borrow. So similar to a moment ago where 5 borrowed into 4, 5 is still going to borrow into 4. But this has nothing to do with tens. This has to do with the theme of the day. 1 can be traded into any fraction like these fractions are. And that's what we're going to do here. 5, we're going to borrow 1 to make 4. And that 1 is going to reappear over here as a fraction. Since we had 6 on the bottom, do 6/6. Now we can borrow. 4 minus 1 is 3. 6 minus 1 is 5. And you never change that bottom number. If you think you got it, try the next one. If you're not sure, listen in, we'll try it again. Okay, this has to be a borrow question. You can't have an empty space minus a thing. We need a fraction to fill this gap. To make a fraction in this gap, so we can do the subtract, we have to borrow. We always borrow 1, so 8 becomes 7. And when we fill in a fraction, we have to make a common denominator. With 5 on the bottom in fraction world, we need to go with 5/5. And then we do it. 7 minus 2 is 5. Fifths on the bottom stay fifths. 5 minus 3 for the tops is a 2. And we're good. Let's go one more time. So if I go 7 minus 2 3/8. Try that out. Pause me, see what you get. Again, we have to borrow. Empty space can't subtract fractions. We need a fraction in that slot. So we have to borrow. We borrow from 7 to make 6. Always borrow 1. And the fraction depends on the bottom of the fraction friend. With an 8 on the bottom, we do 8/8. And now we go at it. 4 and 5/8. One word of caution. Don't go borrow crazy. You don't always have to borrow the whole rest of your life every time there's subtracts involved. If you have an empty space above a fraction, that's when you borrow. This is not a borrow question. This is like 53 in the normal world subtracting 20. You don't have to borrow for this. 3 can subtract empty space to make 3. 5 can subtract 2 to make another 3. You don't always have to borrow in normal subtract. You don't always have to borrow in fraction subtract. If it's a fraction minus an empty, just leave the fraction alone. 5 minus 2 is 3. We did some questions like that the other day. Okay. Borrowing is, again, if we have a number on the top, a number on the bottom, and the fraction is on the bottom. This has got to be a borrow. Empty can't subtract a thing. But if I scooted that upstairs, a thing can subtract an empty can't subtract a thing. This one's easier. Drop the 5/11, subtract that to get 2. This, you can't drop anything, you have to borrow. You can't have nothing subtract something. With an 11, we go 11/11 as we borrowed 1 from that. And that'll make 6/11. There's a 1. Homework that builds off of this, everything we can find on page 56. So 56 is going to go letters from A to J and numbers from 1 to 25. If you run into any trouble, email me. We'll set up a Zoom meeting.